Alina's phone buzzed in her clutch bag at the exact moment. The wedding planner grabbed her arm and hissed that she was standing in the wrong place. Her heart jumped. She had been standing beside the gift table for less than a minute, just trying to catch her breath after the long drive, and already she felt like she had done something wrong. The planner, a thin woman with a headset clipped to her ear, pointed toward the back of the hall. "Family of the bride sits at table 2, the woman said. "But you are not on the list for table 2. You are on table 11. Alina blinked. Table 11. She was the bride's own sister, and she had been placed at table 11, tucked somewhere near the kitchen doors with second cousins she barely remembered and a few of her mother's coworkers. She wanted to argue, but the music had already started, and guests were pouring into the grand hall behind her, filling the air with perfume and laughter, and the clinking of glasses being set down on white tablecloths. She swallowed the sting in her throat and walked toward table 11 without another word. The hall was beautiful, almost unfairly so. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, throwing soft gold light over hundreds of white roses arranged along the aisle. Alina's sister Grace had always dreamed of a wedding like this, and now, at 26, she was finally getting it, marrying a man whose family owned half the shipping companies along the coast. Alina was happy for her. She kept telling herself that as she sat down at the small round table near the back, smoothing the fabric of her navy dress over her knees, glancing at the empty chair beside her where a date should have been sitting. 3 months ago, she had been engaged. 3 months ago, she had pictured herself walking into this exact wedding with a ring on her finger and a fiancé at her side, maybe even joking with Grace about whose wedding would come first. Instead, she had driven 4 hours alone, checked into a hotel room by herself, and was now sitting at table 11, watching happy strangers laugh at tables closer to the front. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her mother. "Where are you sitting? I don't see you." Alina typed back quickly. "Table 11, it's fine, don't worry about it, and enjoy the ceremony." She turned the phone face down on the table and looked up just as the string quartet near the altar began to play. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Grace appeared in a dress made of ivory silk, her arm looped through their father's, her face glowing with the kind of happiness Alina remembered from childhood, back when they used to sneak into their mother's closet and try on her old wedding dress, laughing until they cried. Alina clapped along with everyone else. She smiled because it was the right thing to do, because her sister deserved every bit of joy walking down that aisle toward her. But underneath the smile, something in her chest pulled tight, a familiar ache she had gotten used to carrying since the breakup. She was 29 years old, sitting alone at her younger sister's wedding, and for the first time in a long while, she genuinely wondered if she would ever get her own version of this moment. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and soft music, and her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue 2 rows ahead. When it ended, waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and the guests spilled out into the adjoining reception hall, where round tables had been set with gold chargers and towering centerpieces of white and blush flowers. Alina found her seat again, this time with actual place cards, and discovered she was seated beside a cousin she had met exactly twice in her life, and an elderly aunt who spent most of the meal discussing her recent hip surgery in painstaking detail. Across the table, 2 of Grace's coworkers were deep in conversation about office politics that meant nothing to her. Alina picked at her salad and tried to look interested, nodding at the right moments, laughing when it seemed appropriate. She caught herself glancing toward the head table more than once, where Grace sat glowing beside her new husband, surrounded by bridesmaids in champagne-colored dresses, all of them young and laughing and clearly enjoying themselves. Alina had been a bridesmaid herself once at a friend's wedding 2 years ago. She remembered what it felt like to be seated up front, to be part of the celebration instead of watching it from the shadows. Dinner service continued. Plates were cleared, wine glasses refilled. The best man stood to give his toast, a tall man with an easy laugh who told embarrassing stories about the groom's college years that made the whole room erupt into laughter. Alina laughed too, genuinely this time, caught up in the warmth of the room despite herself. It was during the applause after the toast that she noticed him. He was standing near the bar at the far side of the hall, a tall figure in a charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision that suggested it had been tailored rather than bought off a rack. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't talking to anyone. He simply stood there with a glass of something amber-colored in his hand, watching the room with an expression Alina couldn't quite place. Not bored, exactly. More like he was observing everything from a slight distance, the way someone might watch a play they had already seen before, curious to see how this particular performance would unfold. She didn't recognize him. She knew most of the groom's family, at least by sight, from the rehearsal dinner the night before, and she was certain she had never seen this man among them. He looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair combed back neatly and a jaw that seemed carved rather than simply shaped by nature. Even from across the room, there was something different about the way he carried himself, an ease that didn't come from trying to fit in but from simply not needing to. Alina caught herself staring and quickly looked away, embarrassed, reaching for her wine glass to give her hand something to do. "Who is that?" she asked the aunt beside her, tilting her head slightly toward the bar. The aunt squinted in that direction, adjusting her glasses. "I have no idea, dear. Probably one of the groom's business associates. His family knows all sorts of important people." Alina nodded and let the subject drop, though her eyes drifted back toward the bar more than once over the next half hour, always finding an excuse to glance that way. He hadn't moved much. A few people had approached him, exchanged brief words, and moved on. He seemed polite enough in those exchanges, offering a small nod or a short reply, but he never lingered in conversation the way most guests did, never seemed to fully relax into the crowd the way everyone else had by this point in the evening. The band shifted from dinner music to something livelier, and couples began drifting toward the dance floor. Grace and her new husband took the first dance, spinning slowly under the chandeliers while the room watched and cheered. Alina clapped along, feeling the familiar mixture of joy for her sister and quiet loneliness for herself, a combination she was becoming uncomfortably used to. After the first dance ended, the floor opened up to everyone. Couples paired off, laughing and swaying to the music. Alina stayed at her table, sipping her wine, watching the room fill with movement and color. She told herself she didn't mind. She told herself this was fine, that she could enjoy a wedding without needing someone beside her, that plenty of people came to events alone and had a perfectly good time. She almost believed it. The band slowed into a softer song, something with a gentle piano melody that made several couples pull closer together on the floor. Alina watched a young couple near the edge of the dance floor laugh as the man spun his partner clumsily, both of them nearly falling over before catching each other. She smiled despite herself, the small moment of genuine happiness cutting through her own quiet ache. That was when she noticed him again, and this time he was walking directly toward her table. At first, she assumed he was heading somewhere else, that she had simply misjudged his path, and she looked down at her wine glass to avoid the awkwardness of meeting his eyes if he happened to glance her way. But footsteps stopped directly beside her chair, and when she looked up, he was standing there, close enough now that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from either laughing often or thinking too much. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. His voice was low and even, carrying none of the awkward hesitation most strangers had when approaching someone at a wedding. It wasn't a question asked out of politeness or pity. It sounded, strangely, like something he actually wanted to know the answer to. Alina felt her face flush, painfully aware of the aunt beside her who had gone suspiciously quiet, clearly listening to every word. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "Not yet," he said, and there was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Alexander." He offered his hand, and Alina stared at it for a moment longer than was probably polite, her mind racing through a dozen reasons to say no. She didn't know him. She had no idea why a stranger in an expensive suit was asking her, of all people, to dance, when there were dozens of younger, more confident women scattered throughout the hall who would have said yes without hesitation. But something about the steadiness in his eyes made her curiosity outweigh her caution. "Alina," she said, and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and certain as he helped her rise from her chair, and she was suddenly conscious of every eye at her table watching the exchange, of the aunt's eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. Alina kept her chin up and let him lead her toward the dance floor, trying to ignore the heat crawling up her neck. The band eased into another slow song as they reached the floor, and Alexander turned to face her, one hand settling lightly at her waist while the other took her hand in his. He didn't pull her close the way some men might have, presuming too much too fast. He kept a respectful distance, guiding her into the rhythm of the song with an ease that suggested he had done this many times before, in rooms far grander than this one. "You looked like you needed rescuing," he said after a moment, his eyes meeting hers directly. Alina raised an eyebrow. "Rescuing from what exactly?" "From table 11, he said, and there was that almost smile again. "I saw where they sat you. Seemed like a poor decision on someone's part." Alina let out a short laugh before she could stop herself, surprised at how quickly he had noticed something she thought no one else had. "You saw that?" "I notice things," he said simply. "It's something of a habit." They moved together slowly, turning in small circles beneath the chandeliers, and Alina became aware of a strange sensation settling over her, something she hadn't felt in months. For the first time all evening, she didn't feel like the overlooked older sister sitting alone at the back of the room. She felt, for just a few minutes, entirely seen. "So," she said, trying to keep her voice light, "are you a friend of the groom's, or did you simply wander in off the street looking for free champagne?" Alexander's mouth curved into a real smile this time, brief but genuine. "Something like the first one. My family and his have known each other for years, through business. I was invited more out of obligation than anything else." "That sounds thrilling," Alina said dryly. "It has its moments," he replied, glancing briefly around the hall at the flowers and the chandeliers and the hundreds of guests dressed in their finest. "Though I confess, most of these events blur together after a while. Yours is a rather welcome exception." Alina felt her cheeks warm again, unsure whether it was from the compliment or the way he said it, without any of the practiced smoothness she might have expected from a man clearly accustomed to charming people. There was something almost careful in the way he spoke, as though he chose each word deliberately rather than letting them spill out unconsidered. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, noticing something faintly different in the shape of his vowels, an accent she couldn't quite place, refined but not overly polished, like something worn comfortably rather than performed. "No," he said. "I'm only visiting." "From where?" He hesitated just briefly, and Alina noticed it even though he covered it quickly with another small smile. "Farther than you'd guess," he said, which told her absolutely nothing and somehow made her more curious than a straight answer would have. The song shifted into its final verse, and Alexander guided her through a slow turn, his hand steady at her back. Alina found herself studying his face in the dim golden light, trying to place him, trying to understand why a stranger who clearly didn't need to seek out conversation with anyone had chosen to cross an entire room to ask the overlooked sister to dance. "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. "There are plenty of people here who would have said yes immediately. Younger. Prettier, probably." Something flickered across his expression, not quite offense, but close to it. "I don't think prettier is the right measure," he said. "And I asked you because you looked like the only person in this room who wasn't performing happiness for everyone else's benefit. Everyone else is smiling because they think they're supposed to. You looked like someone actually thinking." Alina didn't have a response for that. She simply looked at him, caught somewhere between surprise and something warmer, something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after everything that had happened with her ex-fiancé. The song ended, and the band paused to let couples catch their breath before starting the next number. Alexander stepped back slightly, though his hand remained loosely around hers. "Thank you for the dance," he said. "Thank you for the rescue," Alina replied, and meant it more than she expected to. He walked her back toward her table, and as they approached, she noticed several heads turning to watch them, including her mother's, several tables away, eyes wide with unmistakable curiosity. Alina felt a small thrill of satisfaction at that, followed almost immediately by embarrassment at feeling satisfaction over something so small. Alexander released her hand at the edge of the table, offering a slight bow of his head, an old-fashioned gesture that seemed strangely natural coming from him rather than affected. "I hope the rest of your evening is kinder to you than the seating chart was," he said. Before Alina could think of a clever response, he had already turned and walked back toward the far side of the hall, disappearing into the crowd near the bar. She sat back down at her table, heart still beating a touch faster than usual, and found the aunt beside her staring with unabashed curiosity. "Well," the aunt said, "who on earth was that?" "I have no idea," Alina admitted, glancing across the room trying to spot him again among the crowd. "He just said his name was Alexander." "He looked important," the aunt said, lowering her voice as though sharing a great secret. "The way he carries himself. Did you see how the waiters practically bowed when he walked past them?" Alina hadn't noticed that, but now that the aunt mentioned it, she recalled the way the man near the bar had refilled Alexander's glass without being asked, the way he had stepped aside slightly whenever Alexander passed, small gestures she hadn't consciously registered in the moment, but that suddenly seemed significant in hindsight. "I'm sure it's nothing," Alina said, though she didn't fully believe it herself. She reached for her wine glass, only to find it empty, and used the excuse to glance once more across the room, searching for the tall figure in the charcoal suit. She spotted him near the edge of the dance floor, in conversation now with an older man Alina recognized as one of the groom's uncles. Alexander was listening politely, nodding at intervals, but his eyes drifted briefly across the room and for a fraction of a second met hers. He didn't smile, not quite, but something in his expression shifted, a small acknowledgement that passed between them across the crowded hall before he returned his attention to the conversation in front of him. Alina turned back to her own table, feeling strangely lighter than she had all evening, as though the weight she had carried since walking into this hall alone had loosened, just slightly, without her fully understanding why. The band began another song, faster this time, and the dance floor filled with laughing couples and giggling children weaving between the adults' legs. Alina watched the celebration continue around her, and for the first time that night, she didn't feel entirely like an outsider looking in. She felt like someone waiting for something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. Across the room, near the bar, Alexander excused himself from his conversation and glanced once more toward table 11, a small, unreadable expression settling over his face before he turned to speak with someone else entirely. Alina didn't see that glance. She was too busy replaying the last 20 minutes in her mind, wondering who exactly this stranger was, and why, out of every woman in that grand hall, he had chosen to walk straight toward her. She had no way of knowing yet that the answer to that question would change the entire course of her life. The music kept playing, but Alina found it harder to focus on the celebration around her. She kept catching herself scanning the crowd for a glimpse of charcoal gray among the sea of pastel dresses and dark suits, telling herself each time that she was simply curious, nothing more, and knowing even as she thought it that it wasn't entirely true. Her mother appeared at her elbow not long after, sliding into the empty chair beside her with the particular urgency of a woman who had been waiting all night for an opportunity to corner her daughter alone. "Who was that man?" her mother asked, barely bothering to lower her voice. "I told you, Mom, I don't know. His name is Alexander." "That's all he said." He asked you to dance in front of the entire hall, her mother said, eyes wide with the kind of delight she usually reserved for gossip about the neighbors. People are talking about it already. Your Aunt Carol says he looked like someone important. Alina rubbed her temple, feeling the beginning of a headache forming behind her eyes. He's probably just a business associate of the groom's family. It was one dance, Mom. It doesn't mean anything. Her mother didn't look convinced, but before she could press further, one of the bridesmaids called her away toward the head table for photographs, leaving Alina alone again with her thoughts and the half-empty wine glass in front of her. She allowed herself another look around the hall. The reception had shifted into its later rhythm now. The kind that came after the formal parts of the evening had concluded and guests settled into the comfortable business of eating, drinking, and dancing, without the pressure of scheduled events. Children ran between tables while their parents laughed and gestured with wine glasses in hand. Somewhere near the cake table, Grace was posing for photographs with her new husband, both of them beaming in a way that made Alina's chest ache with something between happiness and longing. She spotted Alexander again near the edge of the room, this time in conversation with the groom's father, a heavy-set man with a booming laugh who owned most of the shipping company Grace's new husband would one day inherit. Alexander stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, listening with the same polite attentiveness Alina had noticed earlier, occasionally offering a brief nod or a short reply that seemed to satisfy whatever the older man was saying. What struck Alina most was the way the groom's father seemed almost deferential toward him, leaning in slightly when he spoke, laughing a touch too readily at whatever Alexander said in response. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice unless they were paying particular attention, but Alina found herself paying very particular attention indeed. She was still watching when a waiter approached her table, carrying a small silver tray with a single glass of champagne. "Compliments of the gentleman by the bar," the waiter said, setting the glass carefully in front of her. Alina glanced up sharply, searching the crowd until she found him again. Alexander was no longer in conversation with the groom's father. He was looking directly at her from across the room, and when their eyes met, he inclined his head slightly, the barest hint of a smile touching his mouth before he turned his attention back to the crowd. Alina felt heat rise in her cheeks as she picked up the glass, unsure whether to feel flattered or unsettled by the gesture. She had never had anyone send her a drink across a crowded room before, and something about it felt like it belonged in a different kind of story than the one she was living, the kind with grand gestures and sweeping romance rather than quiet disappointments and empty apartments. She took a small sip, the champagne cold and crisp against her tongue, and set the glass back down, glancing once more toward the bar. But Alexander had already moved, weaving through the crowd toward the doors that led out to the hotel's private garden terrace. The rest of dinner passed slowly. Alina picked at a slice of wedding cake, made polite conversation with the elderly aunt about her hip surgery recovery, and half listened as the two coworkers across the table debated something about quarterly reports that meant absolutely nothing to her. Her mind kept drifting back to the dance, to the low certainty in Alexander's voice, to the way he had noticed something about her that even her own family hadn't bothered to see. It was nearly an hour later, as the band took a short break and recorded music filled the hall in the interim, that Alina excused herself from the table and made her way toward the terrace doors, telling herself she simply needed fresh air, that the request had absolutely nothing to do with the man she had watched disappear through those same doors earlier. The night air outside was cool and smelled faintly of the ocean, the hotel having been built along the coastline specifically for occasions like this one. String lights had been hung along the terrace railing, casting a soft, warm glow over the small clusters of guests who had stepped outside to escape the noise and heat of the reception hall. Alina walked to the railing and looked out over the dark water, breathing in the salt air, letting the cool breeze settle some of the nervous energy that had been building in her chest all evening. You found the good part of the evening, a voice said from somewhere behind her. She turned to find Alexander standing a short distance away, leaning casually against one of the stone columns that framed the terrace entrance, his jacket now removed and draped over one arm, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that made him look, for the first time all night, slightly less formal and slightly more human. "I needed air," Alina said. "The champagne, thank you for that, by the way, that was unexpected." "You looked like you needed something to smile about," he said, pushing off from the column and walking toward her, stopping a comfortable distance away, close enough for conversation but not so close as to feel presumptuous. "Did it work?" "A little," she admitted, unable to fully suppress the smile tugging at her mouth. They stood together at the railing for a moment, both looking out at the dark water where the moon cast a thin silver line across the surface of the waves. Alina was acutely aware of him beside her, of the quiet confidence radiating off him even in stillness, of the strange sense that she had known him far longer than the single dance and a few stolen glances across a crowded room. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course." "Why did you really come tonight? You said it was obligation, but you don't seem like someone who does things simply out of obligation." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering the question with more seriousness than she expected. "My family has business ties to the groom's family," he said. "That part is true. But if I'm honest, I nearly didn't come. I've been to more weddings than I can count this year, and most of them feel the same after a while. Beautiful flowers, expensive food, people performing happiness for photographs." He glanced sideways at her. "I almost stayed home tonight." "What changed your mind?" "A promise I made to an old friend," he said, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story than he was willing to share just yet. "But I'm glad I came in the end." Alina studied his profile in the dim terrace light, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to hold something guarded behind their calm surface. "You keep saying things like that," she said. "Vague, careful things. Are you always this mysterious, or is it just me?" He laughed then, a genuine sound that surprised her with its warmth. "It's not intentional, I promise. It's simply habit. I've learned that people tend to treat you differently once they know certain things about you, and sometimes it's nicer to be treated normally, even if only for one evening." "What kind of things?" Alina asked, curiosity overtaking her caution. Before he could answer, the terrace doors opened behind them, and a groomsman Alina recognized from the ceremony stepped outside, phone in hand, clearly searching for someone. His eyes landed on Alexander, and his expression shifted immediately into something almost nervous. "Your Grace," the young man said, straightening slightly as he approached. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. Mr. Whitfield was hoping you might join him for a photograph before the night ends, if you have a moment." Alina felt the words land like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through her thoughts. "Your Grace." She had heard the phrase before, in films and books, always attached to titles she associated with old castles and formal portraits, never with a man standing beside her on a hotel terrace with his sleeves rolled up in a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand. Alexander's expression flickered, something close to embarrassment crossing his face before he smoothed it over. "Of course," he said to the groomsman. "Tell him I'll be along shortly." The young man nodded and disappeared back inside, leaving Alina staring at Alexander with an expression she couldn't quite control. "Your Grace," she repeated slowly. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair, the first genuinely unguarded gesture she had seen from him all evening. "It's a title," he said simply. "Nothing more complicated than that." "That's not nothing," Alina said. "That's a very specific kind of title, isn't it? People don't just call random businessmen Your Grace." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in his mind before he finally spoke. "I hold a dukedom," he said. "It's old, it's mostly ceremonial in practical terms, and it comes with far more obligation than glamour, whatever people assume from films. I don't lead with it generally, because it changes how people behave around me the moment they know. I wanted tonight to simply be a man at a wedding who asked a woman to dance because he wanted to. Alina stared at him, trying to process the sudden shift from stranger to something entirely outside her understanding. A duke. An actual duke, standing on a hotel terrace in the middle of the coast, having asked her, of all people, to dance earlier that evening. I don't know what to say to that, she admitted honestly. You don't have to say anything, Alexander said. I'd actually prefer if you didn't treat it as something significant. I've had quite enough of that for one lifetime. That seems like an unusual thing to complain about, Alina said, a hint of dry humor creeping back into her voice despite the strangeness of the moment. Alexander smiled, and this time it reached his eyes fully. You'd be surprised. Titles attract a certain kind of attention. People want things from you before they even know your name. They see the title before they see the person standing beneath it. He paused, studying her carefully. You didn't do that, not once tonight. You asked who I was because you were curious, not because you were calculating something. Alina felt something warm settle in her chest at that, an unexpected tenderness beneath the shock still coursing through her system. I still don't entirely understand what any of this means, she said. Are you supposed to be in a castle somewhere right now, ruling over farmland or something? He laughed again, louder this time. Something like that, though it's considerably less dramatic in practice. Mostly paperwork and preservation committees and the occasional charity gala. It's not nearly as glamorous as it sounds. It sounds fairly glamorous from where I'm standing, Alina said. Perhaps, he allowed, but titles don't keep you warm at night, Alina. They don't dance particularly well either, as it turns out. She smiled at that, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing. You danced perfectly fine earlier. I had good motivation, he said, holding her gaze a beat longer than was strictly necessary. The terrace doors opened again, and this time it was the same groomsman, clearly sent to retrieve him properly. Alexander sighed and straightened, slipping his jacket back over his shoulders with practiced ease, the transformation from relaxed stranger to composed nobleman happening almost instantly before her eyes. I should go, he said, before Mr. Whitfield sends an entire search party. Of course, Alina said, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of him disappearing back into the crowd, back into a world she suddenly understood was very far removed from her own. He paused before turning away, studying her face for a moment as though committing it to memory. Thank you for tonight, he said quietly, for not asking for anything the moment you learned who I was. You have no idea how rare that is. I still don't entirely know who you are, Alina pointed out. You've told me your first name and a title. That's hardly a complete introduction. Something flickered across his face, amusement mixed with what looked almost like relief. Alexander Ashford, he said, Duke of Camden Hall, though I'd very much prefer if you simply called me Alexander. Alina Hart, she replied. Sister of the bride, occupant of table 11, no titles whatsoever. I think Alina Hart is plenty impressive on her own, he said, and there was nothing performed about the way he said it, no practiced charm, just quiet sincerity that landed somewhere deep in her chest. He excused himself then, walking back toward the terrace doors, and paused just before stepping inside, glancing back at her one final time. I hope I see you again before the night ends, he said, and then he was gone, swallowed back into the golden light and noise of the reception hall. Alina remained on the terrace a while longer, staring out at the dark water, trying to process everything that had just happened. A duke. She had danced with an actual duke, and now she stood alone on a moonlit terrace with her heart pounding in a way she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to admit. When she finally returned inside, the hall had shifted into full celebration, the band back in full swing, guests crowding the dance floor for what appeared to be some kind of group dance that had dissolved into cheerful chaos. She found her way back to table 11, where the elderly aunt immediately leaned toward her with wide, expectant eyes. Well, the aunt asked, where did you disappear to? Just needed some air, Elinor said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts still swirling in her mind. You were gone rather a long time for simply needing air, the aunt observed, though thankfully she didn't press further, distracted instead by one of the other guests calling her toward the dance floor for the next song. Elinor sat alone for a moment, watching the celebration continue around her, replaying every word of the conversation on the terrace. A duke. Somewhere across the room, hidden among the crowd, was a man with an actual title, standing in a room full of people who had no idea, laughing and posing for photographs as though he were nothing more than an ordinary guest. She spotted him eventually, near the head table, standing beside the groom's father for the requested photograph, his expression composed and pleasant, nothing in his posture betraying the vulnerability he had shown her only minutes earlier on the terrace. It was strange, watching him transform so completely between the two versions of himself, the private man who spoke of loneliness beneath a title, and the public figure who commanded quiet deference from everyone around him without seeming to try. Elinor's phone buzzed against the table, and she glanced down to find a text from an unknown number. I hope Table 11 treats you kindly for the rest of the evening. If it doesn't, you know where to find me. She stared at the message, a slow smile spreading across her face despite every rational thought telling her this was moving far too quickly, that men like this didn't simply fall into ordinary lives like hers without complications trailing behind them. She glanced up, searching the crowd until she found him again, still near the head table, though this time he was looking directly at her, phone visible in his hand, a small knowing smile on his face before he slipped the device back into his pocket and turned to greet another well-wisher. Elinor typed back quickly, her fingers trembling slightly with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Table 11 survives, for now, though I hear the company at the bar is considerably better. The reply came almost instantly. Then perhaps we should test that theory again before the night ends. Elinor set her phone down, her heart pounding harder than it had in months, and glanced once more across the crowded hall toward the man who had somehow, in the span of a single evening, turned her entire understanding of the night upside down. Whatever this was, whatever strange and unexpected thing had begun the moment he crossed the room to ask her to dance, she found herself, for the first time since her engagement had ended, genuinely eager to see where it might lead. The night was far from over, and something told her the most interesting part of it had only just begun. Elinor was still smiling at her phone when the doors at the far end of the hall opened again, letting in a gust of cool night air and a figure who did not belong on the guest list. She recognized him instantly, the way one recognizes a sound from a nightmare even half asleep. Owen. Her former fiancé, standing unsteadily in the doorway, his tie loosened and his jacket rumpled, scanning the crowded hall with the kind of determined focus that told Elinor immediately he had been drinking somewhere before deciding to show up uninvited. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't spoken to Owen since the night he ended their engagement over a phone call, citing reasons that still didn't fully make sense to her 3 months later. Something about needing space and not being ready, words that had felt like a slow unraveling of every plan she had built her life around. She had not told him about the wedding. She had certainly never invited him. Yet here he was, weaving slightly as he moved through the crowd, his eyes eventually landing on her table. "Elinor," he called out, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to look. She felt her face flush with a different kind of heat than before. Embarrassment tangled with old hurt and fresh anger at the audacity of him showing up like this, uninvited, at her sister's wedding of all places. She stood quickly, hoping to intercept him before he made more of a scene than he already had. "Owen, what are you doing here?" she said, keeping her voice low, aware of the curious glances from nearby tables. "I heard about the wedding," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Thought I'd come see how you were doing, since you never answer my calls anymore." "That's because we're not together anymore," Elinor said through gritted teeth. "You ended things, remember. You don't get to just show up wherever I am." I made a mistake, Owen said, his voice rising, drawing more attention from surrounding tables. I've been trying to tell you that for weeks. You won't listen. Alina felt her chest tighten with the familiar mixture of anger and old affection that made these kinds of confrontations so exhausting. The part of her that still remembered years of shared history warring with the part that remembered exactly how it felt to be told, calmly and without warning, that he simply wasn't ready anymore. This isn't the time or place, she said firmly. You need to leave, Owen. Not until you talk to me, he said, reaching for her arm. Before his fingers could close around her wrist, a hand appeared between them, firm but not aggressive, simply present in a way that made Owen freeze mid-motion. Alina looked up to find Alexander standing beside her, having crossed the room so quickly and quietly she hadn't even noticed his approach. I believe the lady asked you to leave, Alexander said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that seemed to fill the space around them. Owen blinked up at him, swaying slightly, clearly trying to place who this stranger was and why he had inserted himself into what Owen apparently still considered a private matter. Who exactly are you? He demanded. A friend of the family, Alexander said simply, and I'd strongly suggest you consider the lady's request before this becomes more embarrassing than it already is. Something in Alexander's tone, quiet as it was, seemed to cut through Owen's alcohol-fueled confidence. He looked between Alexander and Alina, his jaw working as though searching for something clever to say, but finding nothing. This isn't over, Owen muttered, though the fight had visibly drained from his posture. I think it is, Alina said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. Please leave, Owen. Don't make me call security. By now, 2 of the hotel's event staff had noticed the disturbance and were making their way toward the table with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first uninvited guest situation. Owen glanced at them approaching, then back at Alina, something like genuine regret flickering across his expression before he turned and allowed himself to be quietly escorted toward the exit, muttering something under his breath that Alina didn't bother trying to hear. The moment he disappeared through the doors, the tension in her shoulders released all at once, leaving her slightly shaky, adrenaline still coursing through her system from the confrontation. Several nearby guests were still watching, whispering to each other, and Alina felt the old familiar urge to disappear into the floor, to become invisible again the way she had felt sitting alone at table 11 earlier that evening. Are you all right? Alexander asked quietly, his hand resting lightly at her elbow, steadying rather than presumptuous. I'm fine, Alina said, though her voice wavered slightly. That was my ex-fiancé. He has a talent for terrible timing. I gathered as much, Alexander said. Would you like to step outside again? Somewhere quieter. Alina nodded gratefully, allowing him to guide her back toward the terrace doors, away from the curious eyes still lingering on their table. The cool night air hit her face like a balm the moment they stepped outside, and she leaned against the stone railing, taking a long breath to steady herself. I'm sorry you had to see that, she said finally. That's not exactly the impression I wanted to make tonight. You have nothing to apologize for, Alexander said, standing beside her at the railing. He's the one who should be apologizing, showing up drunk and uninvited to make a scene at your sister's wedding. He does that, Alina said with a humorless laugh. Make scenes, I mean. It's part of why things ended, if I'm honest. He always needed to be the center of attention, even when it wasn't his moment. Alexander was quiet for a moment, watching her carefully in the dim terrace light. Can I ask what happened between you? You don't have to tell me, of course, but I find myself curious. Alina hesitated, unsure how much of her personal history she wanted to share with a man she had known for less than 2 hours, Duke or not. But something about the quiet steadiness of his presence made the words come easier than she expected. We were together for 4 years, she said slowly. Engaged for the last year of that. I thought we were building something permanent, you know, the kind of life people talk about wanting. Then one night, out of nowhere, he called me and said he wasn't ready, that he needed space to figure out who he was outside of a relationship. She let out a bitter laugh, as if 4 years together hadn't given him plenty of time to figure that out already. That must have been incredibly painful, Alexander said, and there was nothing performative in the sympathy in his voice. It was, Alina admitted, is sometimes, if I'm being honest, tonight especially, watching my sister get everything I thought I was going to have. She paused, surprised at how easily the admission had slipped out, how comfortable she suddenly felt sharing something so raw with someone she had only just met. I'm sorry, that's probably more than you wanted to know. Not at all, Alexander said. I asked because I wanted to know. There's a difference. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of distant music drifting through the terrace doors behind them, mixing with the quiet rhythm of waves against the shoreline below. Can I share something with you as well? Alexander said eventually. Something I don't often share with people I've just met. Of course, Alina said, turning to face him more fully. My own engagement ended a year ago, he said, his voice quieter now, more guarded than she had heard it all evening. For very different reasons than yours, but the sting is not so different, I think. Alina felt something shift in her chest, an unexpected kinship forming between them in the shared vulnerability of the moment. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? Alexander looked out over the dark water for a long moment before answering. She wanted the title more than she wanted me, he said simply. It took me longer than it should have to realize that. We were together for 2 years, and I genuinely believed she loved me, until I overheard her discussing our wedding plans with her mother in terms that had absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with the estate, the properties, the social standing that would come with becoming a duchess. He paused. I ended things the same week. I'm sorry, Alina said softly. That's a particular kind of loneliness, isn't it? Wondering if anyone will ever want you for yourself, rather than what you can offer them. Exactly that, Alexander said, glancing at her with something like surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to understand so precisely. It's part of why tonight felt different. You had no idea who I was when you agreed to dance with me. You still don't fully know, if I'm honest, beyond a title and a last name. I know you noticed I was sitting alone at table 11, Alina said. I know you sent me champagne and told a drunk ex-fiancé to leave a wedding he wasn't invited to. That's more than most people bother to learn about anyone in an entire lifetime. Something in Alexander's expression softened, the guarded quality that had colored his features moments ago giving way to something warmer, more open. You have a way of putting things simply, he said. I find it refreshing. The terrace doors opened again, and this time it was Grace, Alina's sister, still glowing in her wedding dress, though her expression carried a note of concern as she spotted Alina standing with Alexander near the railing. There you are, Grace said, hurrying over. Mom told me what happened with Owen. Are you okay? I'm fine, Alina assured her, offering a reassuring smile. Alexander handled it before it became a real problem. Grace's eyes shifted to Alexander, taking in his appearance with the same startled curiosity Alina herself had felt earlier that evening. Thank you, Grace said sincerely. I'm so sorry he showed up like that. I had no idea he even knew about the wedding. It's no trouble at all, Alexander said smoothly. I'm simply glad I was nearby. Grace glanced between the two of them, something knowing flickering across her expression despite the chaos of the last few minutes. Well, I should get back before Julian wonders where I've disappeared to, she said, giving Alina's hand a quick squeeze. Come find me before you leave tonight, okay? I want to hear everything. She disappeared back inside, leaving Alina and Alexander alone once more on the quiet terrace, the noise of the reception muffled behind the closed doors. Your sister seems kind, Alexander observed. She is, Alina agreed. Sometimes I forget that, caught up in my own head about everything, but she's always been the more generous one between the two of us. I doubt that's entirely true, Alexander said. Generosity looks different in different people. Yours seems to come out in smaller, quieter ways. The way you spoke to your ex-fiancé, even angry as you were, there was still restraint in it. Kindness, even when it wasn't deserved. Alina felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the observation, the sense of being truly seen settling over her again the way it had during their first dance. You notice a lot of things, she said. I told you it's a habit, he replied, a small smile playing at his mouth. They stood together for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory, favorite books and childhood memories, and the strange, meandering paths that had brought each of them to this particular terrace on this particular night. Alina found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, the weight of the evening's earlier disappointment slowly lifting with each passing minute in his company. Eventually, the sound of the band shifting into a livelier song drifted out through the doors, followed by muffled cheering that suggested some kind of group activity had begun inside. I believe that might be the bouquet toss, Alexander said, glancing toward the doors with amusement. Should we go witness the chaos? Alina laughed. As the older, unmarried sister, I'm somewhat obligated to participate, unfortunately. Then I shall accompany you, Alexander said, offering his arm with an old-fashioned courtesy that made Alina's heart flutter despite herself. Someone should be there to console you if you fail to catch it. Or to celebrate if I do, Alina countered, taking his arm. They walked back inside together, and Alina felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely excited about what the rest of the evening might hold. Whatever complications existed in dating a man with a title and an entirely different world waiting for him somewhere far from this coastal hotel, she found herself unwilling, for tonight at least, to let those complications dampen the strange and unexpected joy blooming in her chest. The bouquet toss proved as chaotic as promised, a crowd of unmarried women gathering near the dance floor while Grace prepared to throw her bouquet over her shoulder. Alina found herself pushed toward the front of the group by an overly enthusiastic bridesmaid, and when Grace finally released the flowers, Alina watched, almost in slow motion, as the bouquet arced through the air directly toward her, landing squarely in her outstretched hands amid a chorus of surprised laughter and applause. She turned, flushed and laughing, searching instinctively for Alexander in the crowd, and found him standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching her with an expression of open delight that made something warm settle deep in her chest. Well, he said, approaching as the crowd dispersed around them, it appears fate has spoken. Don't read too much into it, Alina said, though she was smiling too widely to sound entirely convincing. It's just tradition, not prophecy. Perhaps, Alexander said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. Though I've always found traditions carry more truth than people give them credit for. The band began another song, and this time, without either of them needing to voice the question, Alexander simply extended his hand, and Alina took it without hesitation, letting him lead her back toward the dance floor for what felt, somehow, like the beginning of something far larger than a single wedding reception could possibly contain. They danced through 2 more songs before Alexander's phone buzzed insistently against his hip, breaking the easy rhythm they had fallen into. He glanced at the screen with a small frown, and Alina felt a flicker of disappointment settle in her stomach, sensing already what was coming. I'm sorry, he said, stepping back slightly. I have to take this. He walked a short distance away, phone pressed to his ear, his posture straightening in a way Alina had come to recognize as the shift from the private version of him to the public one. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tension building in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as he listened. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression had changed, something urgent replacing the relaxed warmth from moments before. I have to leave, he said, and the regret in his voice sounded genuine, not simply polite. There's a matter back home that requires my attention immediately. A flight has already been arranged. Alina felt her chest tighten with disappointment, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. Tonight, right now. Within the hour, I'm afraid, he said. I wouldn't leave if it weren't necessary. There's been an issue with the estate, something involving my mother, and I need to be there in person. Of course, Alina said, forcing a smile despite the sudden ache in her chest. I understand. Family comes first. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, and something in his expression softened further, as though he were memorizing the details before turning away. I don't want this to be goodbye, he said quietly. Not permanently, at least. Then don't let it be, Alina said, surprising herself with the boldness of the statement. A small smile broke across his face, chasing away some of the urgency that had settled there moments before. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a slim black card, pressing it into her hand along with something else, a folded piece of paper that felt like it had been written on hastily. My personal number, he said, not the one my assistants screen. I would very much like to hear from you, Alina Hart, whenever you're willing to reach out. I will, she said, tucking the card carefully into her small clutch bag, aware of how much weight the simple gesture seemed to carry. He hesitated a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say something else, before finally leaning down and pressing a light kiss to her cheek, his lips warm against her skin, lingering just a fraction longer than a simple farewell required. Until we speak again, he murmured, close enough that only she could hear. Then he was moving, striding toward the exit with the same quiet authority he had carried all evening, pausing only briefly to offer a polite farewell to Grace and her new husband before disappearing through the doors into the night. Alina stood frozen for a moment, her cheeks still warm from the kiss, the small black card feeling impossibly heavy in her clutch bag. Around her, the reception continued its joyful chaos, oblivious to the strange, sudden absence that had opened up in her chest the moment he walked away. Her mother appeared beside her almost instantly, having clearly witnessed the entire exchange from across the room. Well, she demanded, what happened? Where is he going? Something about his family, Alina said, still slightly dazed. He had to leave suddenly. Did he give you his number? Her mother asked, practically vibrating with curiosity. Alina patted her clutch bag gently. He did. Her mother's face broke into a delighted grin. A duke, Alina, an actual duke gave you his number. It's complicated, Mom, Alina said, though she couldn't fully suppress her own smile. I don't even know what any of this means yet. It means you should call him, her mother said firmly, sooner rather than later. The rest of the wedding passed in something of a blur for Alina. The earlier drama with Owen, and the sudden, unexpected connection with Alexander leaving her feeling emotionally wrung out by the time the final guests began trickling toward the exits. She found Grace near midnight, sitting quietly with her new husband at the edge of the now sparsely populated dance floor, both of them looking exhausted but happy in the way only newlyweds could manage. So, Grace said, patting the seat beside her, tell me everything about your mysterious duke. Alina sank into the chair, suddenly feeling the full weight of the long day settle into her bones. I don't even know where to start, she admitted. It's been the strangest night of my life. Start with how he asked you to dance, Grace suggested, eyes bright with curiosity despite her own exhaustion. Alina recounted the evening slowly, the dance, the champagne, the conversation on the terrace, the confrontation with Owen, and finally the sudden departure and the small black card now tucked safely in her bag. Grace listened with rapt attention, occasionally squeezing Alina's hand or gasping at particular details, especially the part about the Duke title. You have to call him, Grace said once Alina finished. Please tell me you're going to call him. I don't know, Alina admitted. It's all so fast and so strange. He lives in a completely different world than I do, Grace. What happens after the number gets called? Do I fly out to some castle somewhere? Do I meet his family? I don't even know where he's from exactly. You won't know any of that unless you call him, Grace pointed out gently. You deserve something good happening in your life, Ellie. After everything with Owen, after months of feeling like you were stuck in place while everyone around you moved forward, maybe this is the universe finally giving you something back. Alina considered her sister's words as the last of the guests began departing, the hotel staff moving efficiently around them to begin clearing tables and folding chairs. Somewhere in this same building, in a room 3 floors above, Alina's own hotel room waited, and inside her clutch bag, a small black card sat with a phone number that could either lead nowhere or somewhere entirely unexpected. She said her goodbyes to Grace and her new husband, wishing them well before they departed for their honeymoon suite, and made her way slowly back to her own room, the events of the night replaying continuously in her mind. She changed out of her navy dress, hung it carefully in the hotel closet, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in one hand and the small black card in the other, staring at the elegant handwriting scrawled across the folded paper he had pressed into her palm. "Call me when you're ready. I meant everything I said tonight. A." Alina read the note 3 times, tracing her thumb over the ink as though it might reveal something more than the simple words already written there. Outside her window, the ocean continued its steady rhythm against the shore, indifferent to the storm of possibility churning inside her chest. She thought about Owen, about the humiliation of his sudden appearance and the way 4 years of shared history had dissolved into nothing more than a drunken scene at her sister's wedding. She thought about Table 11, about feeling invisible for the first half of the evening, certain she would spend the entire night quietly disappointed, while everyone around her celebrated love she no longer believed she deserved. And she thought about Alexander, about the steady warmth in his voice when he asked her to dance, about the vulnerability he had shown her on the terrace, about the way he had stepped between her and Owen without hesitation, protective in a way that felt entirely different from the possessiveness she had sometimes sensed from Owen during their years together. She didn't call that night. It felt too soon, too raw, the events of the evening still settling into something she could properly process. Instead, she saved the number carefully into her phone under a simple name, Alexander, no last name, no title, nothing that might remind her of the strange and complicated world he inhabited. She fell asleep eventually, the small black card resting on the nightstand beside her, the note tucked safely underneath it, and dreamed, for the first time in months, of something other than the quiet disappointment that had colored so many of her recent nights. 3 days later, sitting alone in her apartment on a rainy Tuesday evening, Alina finally worked up the courage to send a single text message to the number saved in her phone. Table 11 survived the wedding, thanks in part to a rather unexpected rescue. Thought you should know. The reply came within minutes, and Alina's heart leapt at the sight of it, at the realization that whatever strange thing had begun on that terrace 3 nights ago was, apparently, far from over. "I was hoping you'd write. How is Alina Hart, sister of the bride, occupant of Table 11? Curious, Alina typed back, smiling despite herself, about a certain duke who left rather suddenly. "I'm afraid that's rather a long story," came the reply. "Would you be willing to hear it over dinner? I find myself back in the country sooner than expected." Alina stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty that had followed her since the wedding night, before finally typing her response, unable to suppress the smile spreading across her face as she did. "I think I would like that very much." The restaurant Alexander chose for their first proper dinner was tucked away on a quiet side street downtown, the kind of place with no sign out front, only a small brass plaque beside an unmarked door that Alina would have walked past entirely if she hadn't been looking for it specifically. Inside, the space was warm and intimate, dim lighting and candles on every table, the murmur of quiet conversation filling the air rather than the clatter and noise she associated with most restaurants in the city. She spotted him immediately at a corner table, already standing as she approached, dressed simply this time in a dark sweater and slacks rather than the formal suit from the wedding, though he somehow still managed to look as though he belonged in far grander surroundings than this quiet little restaurant. "You found it," he said, pulling out her chair before she could reach for it herself. "Barely," Alina admitted, settling into the seat. "I walked past this street twice before I noticed the door." "That's rather the point," Alexander said, taking his own seat across from her. "It's owned by a friend of mine. He prefers to keep things private, away from anyone who might recognize certain guests." Alina raised an eyebrow. "Certain guests like yourself, you mean?" "Something like that," Alexander admitted with a small smile. "I hope you don't mind the secrecy. I promise the food more than makes up for the inconvenience." The evening unfolded slowly, comfortably, the kind of dinner that stretched far longer than either of them intended, courses arriving and disappearing while conversation flowed easily between them. Alina learned that Alexander had grown up primarily in the countryside, on an estate that had been in his family for nearly 3 centuries. Though he had spent much of his 20s studying and working abroad before the sudden death of his father 4 years earlier had thrust the title and its accompanying responsibilities onto his shoulders far sooner than he had expected. "I wasn't ready for it," he admitted, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. "Not really. I had plans back then to pursue something entirely different, architecture actually. I wanted to design buildings, not manage an estate full of tenant farms and centuries-old obligations." "Do you regret it?" Alina asked, "having to give that up?" Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "though I've come to find purpose in the responsibility, even if it wasn't what I originally chose. There are people who depend on the estate for their livelihoods, families who have worked that land for generations. I couldn't simply walk away from that, not without feeling like I'd abandoned something important." "That sounds like a heavy weight to carry," Alina said gently. "It is sometimes," he agreed. "Though tonight, sitting here with you, it feels considerably lighter than usual." Alina felt warmth spread through her chest at the admission, the easy vulnerability with which he shared these details feeling like a gift rather than an obligation. In turn, she found herself opening up about her own life, about the marketing job she had built slowly over the past 6 years, about the apartment she had furnished carefully after the breakup with Owen, determined to make it feel like a home rather than simply a place she was waiting to leave. "You seem like someone who builds things carefully," Alexander observed. "Even your apartment, the way you describe it, deliberate, thoughtful." "I suppose I am," Alina said, surprised by the observation. "Owen used to say I overthink everything, that I plan too much instead of just letting things happen." "I don't think there's anything wrong with careful consideration," Alexander said. "Some of the most important things in life deserve exactly that kind of attention." They lingered over dessert, a shared plate of something rich and chocolate that Alina barely tasted, too absorbed in the conversation. And the way Alexander's eyes seemed to hold hers with genuine interest, rather than the polite, distracted attention she had grown used to during the final months with Owen. "Can I ask you something personal?" Alina said as the evening wound toward its natural end. "Of course." "Your family, what do they think about all this? About you having dinner with someone who isn't exactly from your world?" Something flickered across Alexander's face, brief but noticeable, before he composed his expression again. "My mother has certain expectations," he said carefully, "about who I should be spending my time with, particularly given what happened with my previous engagement. She's grown rather protective, understandably so, though sometimes that protectiveness manifests as pressure I don't particularly welcome." "Pressure to marry someone more suitable, you mean?" Alina said, understanding immediately. "Something like that," Alexander admitted. "Though I should say, I've never particularly cared for other people's definitions of suitable. My father married my mother against considerable family objection, actually. She came from a family with no title at all, simply wealth from trade, which apparently mattered a great deal 50 years ago." He smiled slightly. "They were happily married for 30 years until his death. I've always found that history rather instructive. Alina felt something ease in her chest at the story, though a small knot of worry remained, the awareness that whatever was building between them existed within a world with its own complicated rules and expectations, rules she had no experience navigating. "I don't want to be a complication in your life," she said honestly. "If this is going to cause problems with your family, with your position, I need you to be honest with me about that." Alexander reached across the table, his hand covering hers gently. "You're not a complication, Alina. You're the first genuinely uncomplicated thing that's happened to me in years. Everyone else who enters my life arrives already calculating what they might gain from the association. You looked at me across a wedding hall and saw someone worth talking to, nothing more, nothing less. That's rare enough that I intend to protect it, whatever challenges arise." The sincerity in his voice settled something anxious in Alina's chest, and she found herself smiling despite the lingering uncertainty about what exactly lay ahead. "Then I suppose we'll navigate the challenges as they come," she said. "I suppose we will," Alexander agreed, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles before he withdrew his hand, seemingly reluctant to break the contact entirely. They left the restaurant close to midnight, walking together along the quiet street outside, the city lights reflecting off puddles left from an earlier rain. Alexander offered to drive her home, and Alina accepted, settling into the passenger seat of a sleek black car she hadn't noticed parked outside earlier, driven by a man Alexander introduced simply as Marcus, an employee who had apparently been waiting patiently through the entire 3-hour dinner without complaint. "Does he always wait like that?" Alina asked quietly as they pulled away from the curb. "He's used to it," Alexander said with a small laugh, "though I imagine tonight was a more pleasant wait than usual, given the company I was keeping." Alina laughed, some of the earlier tension fully dissolving as the city passed by outside the window, streetlights blurring into soft golden streaks against the darkness. They talked easily during the drive, about nothing in particular, the comfortable kind of conversation that filled silences without needing to accomplish anything beyond simply enjoying each other's company. When they arrived at her apartment building, Alexander walked her to the door despite her assurances that it wasn't necessary, insisting with quiet stubbornness that he wanted to see her safely inside. "Thank you for tonight," Alina said, standing at her door, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been all evening. "I haven't had a night like this in a long time." "Neither have I," Alexander said softly. "I'd like there to be many more if you're willing." "I think I'd like that too," Alina said. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted to, and when she didn't, his lips met hers gently, warm and unhurried, nothing like the rushed, distracted kisses she remembered from the final months with Owen. Alina felt something settle deep in her chest, a certainty she hadn't expected to feel this soon after everything that had happened, the sense that whatever this was building into, it was worth whatever complications might follow. When they finally broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead lightly against hers for a moment, both of them smiling in the dim glow of the hallway light. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, "if that's all right." "I'd like that very much," Alina said. He pressed one more soft kiss to her forehead before stepping back, watching until she was safely inside her apartment before turning to walk back toward the waiting car. Alina leaned against her closed door for a long moment after he left, her heart still racing, replaying every moment of the evening in her mind. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened steadily, dinners becoming a regular occurrence, followed by long phone calls late into the night when his obligations kept him traveling between the city and his family's estate several hours away. Alina learned more about his world gradually, the complicated web of responsibilities that came with his title, the tenant families whose livelihoods depended on decisions he made about the estate's future, the charitable foundations his family had maintained for generations, the constant, low-level scrutiny that came from being someone whose name, occasionally appeared in society pages he claimed to have no interest in reading. She met a few of his close friends eventually, small gatherings at his city apartment that felt refreshingly ordinary despite the obvious wealth surrounding them, conversations about films and books and current events that could have happened anywhere, with anyone. Alexander seemed most relaxed in these moments, away from the formal obligations of his title, laughing easily and teasing his friends with the kind of warmth Alina was coming to recognize as entirely genuine. But beneath the growing comfort of their relationship, a quiet unease continued to build in Alina's chest, the awareness that eventually, this bubble of easy intimacy would have to expand to include the parts of his world she hadn't yet encountered. His mother, in particular, remained a topic he approached carefully, mentioning her only in passing, always with a slight tension in his voice that suggested the relationship between mother and son carried complications neither of them had fully worked through. It was nearly 6 weeks after the wedding, on an unseasonably warm evening in early autumn, that Alexander finally raised the subject directly, over dinner at her apartment this time, a rare evening where he had insisted on cooking for her despite her skepticism about his culinary abilities. "My mother would like to meet you," he said carefully, setting down his fork as though bracing for her reaction. "She's hosting a small gathering at the estate next month, and I'd very much like you to attend if you're willing." Alina felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "A gathering," she repeated slowly. "How small are we talking?" "Smaller than most," Alexander assured her. "Family, a few close friends. Nothing like the wedding you attended, I promise." "And your mother knows about me already?" Alina asked. "About us?" "She's aware I've been seeing someone," Alexander said. "I haven't shared many details yet, mostly because I wanted to protect what we've built before subjecting it to outside opinions. But I think it's time, Alina. If this is something you want to continue building, my family needs to become part of that eventually." Alina considered his words carefully, aware of the significance of what he was asking, the step from private romance into something that would inevitably become more public, more scrutinized, more complicated by expectations she barely understood. "I want that too," she said finally. "I'm just nervous if I'm honest. Meeting your mother feels like a much bigger step than I'm entirely prepared for." "You'll be wonderful," Alexander said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And whatever happens, whatever she thinks initially, know that my feelings for you aren't contingent on her approval. I care about you, Alina. That isn't going to change based on one dinner, however important it might feel." Alina squeezed his hand gratefully, trying to let his reassurance settle the anxious knot forming in her stomach, though some part of her couldn't fully shake the sense that this next step, however necessary, might bring challenges neither of them were fully prepared to face. The drive to Camden Hall took nearly 3 hours, the city gradually giving way to rolling countryside, stone walls dividing green fields, small villages with church spires rising above clusters of cottages. Alina sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the landscape shift, her nervousness building steadily with every mile that passed. "You're quiet," Alexander observed, glancing over at her from the driver's seat. "I'm nervous," Alina admitted. "I keep trying to imagine what your mother is like and I keep failing." "She's not as intimidating as you're probably imagining," Alexander said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own reassurance. "She can be reserved with new people, formal even. But she cares deeply about this family, about doing right by it, even when her methods aren't always what I'd choose myself." Alina nodded, trying to absorb the information, though anxiety continued to churn steadily in her stomach as they turned off the main road onto a long private drive lined with ancient oak trees, their branches forming a natural canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns across the gravel path. The house itself, when it finally came into view, took Alina's breath away despite every attempt Alexander had made to prepare her for it. Camden Hall rose from the surrounding parkland like something from a different century, gray stone walls climbing 3 stories high, dozens of windows catching the light, formal gardens stretching out on either side of the main entrance in careful, symmetrical patterns. "You said your family owned an estate," Elinor said quietly, staring up at the imposing structure as the car rolled to a stop before the entrance. "You didn't mention it was a castle." "Technically it's a manor house, not a castle," Alexander said with a slight smile, though he seemed to be watching her reaction carefully. "Though I understand the confusion." They stepped out of the car, and Elinor smoothed the fabric of her dress nervously, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place she must look against the grandeur surrounding her. The heavy front doors opened before they reached the top of the stone steps, revealing a woman standing in the entrance hall who could only be Alexander's mother, tall and elegant, silver hair swept into an immaculate style, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Elinor's entire monthly salary. "Mother," Alexander said, leaning down to kiss her cheek, "this is Elinor Hart." "Elinor, my mother, the Dowager Duchess." The woman's eyes moved over Elinor with a slow, assessing quality that made her feel suddenly and uncomfortably transparent, as though every insecurity and inadequacy were laid bare for immediate inspection. "Miss Hart," the Duchess said, her voice cool but polite, "Alexander has spoken of you." "Thank you for having me," Elinor said, keeping her voice steady despite the nervousness twisting in her chest. "You have a beautiful home." "It's been in the family for 3 centuries, the Duchess replied, a note of pride entering her voice for the first time. "Please come inside. The others have already arrived." The interior of the house proved just as impressive as the exterior. High ceilings and elaborate moldings, portraits of ancestors lining the walls of a long gallery they walked through on their way to what the Duchess referred to simply as the drawing room. Elinor caught glimpses of rooms branching off in every direction, each one seemingly decorated with the same careful attention to historical detail, antique furniture polished to a warm shine, fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases throughout. The gathering, when they reached it, proved smaller than Elinor had feared but still intimidating in its own way. A dozen or so guests scattered around the elegant drawing room, engaged in quiet conversation over afternoon tea. Alexander introduced her to several relatives and family friends, names and titles blurring together in Elinor's mind as she tried desperately to keep track of who was who, aware of curious glances following her throughout the room. She found a small measure of comfort in Alexander's steady presence beside her, his hand occasionally finding hers, grounding her through the unfamiliar rhythms of formal conversation and careful social navigation. But she couldn't shake the sense of being watched, measured, weighed against some invisible standard she had no way of understanding. It was nearly an hour into the gathering, during a lull in conversation while Alexander stepped away to speak with an elderly cousin, that the Duchess approached Elinor directly, settling into the chair beside her with the kind of deliberate purpose that suggested this conversation had been planned in advance. "Miss Hart," the Duchess began, "may I ask what your intentions are with my son?" Elinor blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I'm sorry." "It's a simple question," the Duchess continued, her tone remaining pleasant despite the pointed nature of her words. "Alexander has had his heart broken once already, quite publicly, by a woman who claimed to love him but ultimately valued his title far more than the man himself. I'm sure you understand my concern about protecting him from a similar experience." "I understand your concern completely," Elinor said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate care. "But I can assure you, I didn't even know Alexander held a title until well after I agreed to dance with him at my sister's wedding. I'm not interested in what he can offer me, materially speaking. I'm interested in him." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, something unreadable behind her composed expression. "That's precisely what the last one said as well," she said finally. "Words are inexpensive, Miss Hart. Actions over time tend to reveal truth far more reliably." Then I suppose you'll simply have to watch and see, Alina replied, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice despite the intimidation she felt. I don't have anything else to offer you beyond that. Something flickered across the Duchess's expression, perhaps grudging respect, though it disappeared too quickly for Alina to be certain. You're bolder than the last one, at least, the Duchess observed. That's something, I suppose. Before the conversation could continue further, Alexander returned, glancing between his mother and Alina with obvious concern. Everything all right here? Perfectly fine, the Duchess said smoothly, rising from her seat. Miss Hart and I were simply getting acquainted. She offered Alina a small, unreadable nod before moving away to attend to other guests, leaving Alina slightly shaken, but oddly proud of having survived the exchange without backing down. What did she say to you? Alexander asked quietly once his mother was out of earshot. She's protective of you, Alina said simply. I can't fault her for that, even if her methods are a bit intense. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I should have warned you she might approach you directly like that. It's fine, Alina assured him. I think I held my own, actually. The rest of the gathering passed with somewhat less tension, though Alina remained acutely aware of the Duchess's occasional glances from across the room, evaluating, still uncertain. As the afternoon wound toward evening, Alexander offered to show Alina the estate's gardens before dinner, and she accepted eagerly, grateful for the chance to escape the formal atmosphere of the drawing room, even briefly. The gardens stretched out behind the main house in elaborate, carefully maintained sections, rose bushes still blooming despite the approaching autumn, a long reflecting pool stretching toward a distant folly built to resemble a small Greek temple. Alexander led her along the gravel paths, pointing out features that had been added by various ancestors over the centuries, clearly proud of the history surrounding them despite the complicated relationship he seemed to have with the responsibilities that came attached to it. I know today was difficult, he said as they paused beside the reflecting pool, the last golden light of the afternoon catching the surface of the water. My mother can be formidable when she wants to be. I think I understand her, actually, Alina said thoughtfully. If I had a son who'd been hurt the way you were, I'd probably be protective too. I don't think she's wrong to be cautious, even if it's uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of that caution. You're remarkably understanding, Alexander said, studying her with obvious admiration. Most people would have been offended by her directness. I was a little, Alina admitted with a small laugh. But mostly I just want her to eventually see what you already see in me, whatever that is. Alexander reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers as they continued walking along the path. She'll come around, he said with quiet confidence. It might take time, but she will. I have faith in that, and I have faith in us. Alina squeezed his hand gratefully, allowing herself to believe, at least for this quiet moment beside the reflecting pool, that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would find a way through them together. The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, and for the first time since arriving at Camden Hall, Alina felt something close to peace settle over her, despite the uncertainty still lingering beneath the surface of the beautiful afternoon. The trouble began 3 weeks after the visit to Camden Hall, on an ordinary Thursday morning that gave no warning of the storm about to descend on Alina's carefully rebuilt life. She was getting ready for work, coffee in hand, phone propped against the bathroom mirror while she scrolled through messages, when a text from her sister stopped her cold. Have you seen this? Grace had written, followed by a link. Alina tapped the link with growing dread, and her stomach dropped as a webpage loaded, a tabloid site she vaguely recognized from headlines she usually scrolled past without reading. The headline itself made her blood run cold. Duke's mystery woman revealed. Marketing assistant with history of broken engagements sets sights on Camden fortune. Below the headline sat photographs, grainy but unmistakably clear, Images of her and Alexander walking together outside the restaurant weeks earlier, another of them at the estate's front entrance during her visit, and worst of all, an old photograph from her engagement announcement with Owen, pulled from some archived social media post she had forgotten even existed. The article itself proved even more damaging than the headline suggested, painting Alina as calculating and opportunistic, suggesting her relationship with Owen had ended not because he had grown cold, but because she had been caught pursuing wealthier prospects, a narrative that bore no resemblance to reality but read convincingly enough to anyone who didn't know the truth. Quotes attributed to unnamed sources close to the family suggested the Dowager Duchess had significant concerns about Alina's true motivations, phrases that made Alina's stomach twist with a horrible suspicion about where such quotes might have originated. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Alexander, and she answered with trembling hands. "Have you seen it?" he asked immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm looking at it right now," Alina said, her own voice unsteady. "Alexander, this is horrible. Who would even do this?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out. I'm sorry, Alina. This is exactly the kind of intrusion I was hoping to protect you from." "It says quotes came from someone close to your family," Alina said carefully, unable to fully suppress the anxious question forming in her mind. "Your mother wouldn't have said something like this, would she?" There was a brief pause on the line, long enough that Alina's stomach twisted further with uncertainty. "I don't believe so," Alexander said finally, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain himself. "I'll speak with her directly. In the meantime, please don't respond to any of this publicly. My lawyers are already working on it." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety, Alina barely able to focus on her work as her phone continued buzzing with messages from friends and family who had seen the article, some sympathetic, others clearly curious about details she had no intention of sharing. By the time she arrived home that evening, she felt utterly drained, the careful, private happiness she had built with Alexander over the past weeks suddenly exposed to public scrutiny in the ugliest possible way. Alexander arrived at her apartment that evening, his expression grim as he stepped inside, immediately pulling her into a tight embrace before she could say anything. "I spoke with my mother," he said once they had settled onto her couch, his arms still wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "She swears she had nothing to do with the article, and I believe her, actually. She's many things, but deliberately sabotaging me publicly isn't one of them, whatever her private reservations might be." "Then who?" Alina asked, though a sinking suspicion had already begun forming in her mind. "I think I know," Alexander said grimly. "I had my assistant do some digging this afternoon. The photographs, particularly the one from the estate, could only have come from someone with access to the property that day or someone tracking us specifically. And the details about your previous engagement, the framing of it, that felt personal in a way that suggested someone with direct knowledge trying to hurt you specifically." Alina felt her stomach drop as the pieces clicked together. "Owen," she said quietly, "you think Owen sold this story?" "I think it's a strong possibility," Alexander said. "My lawyers are investigating the payment trail behind the article as we speak. If he's responsible, we'll have legal recourse, though I know that likely won't undo the damage already done." Alina buried her face in her hands, exhaustion and anger and hurt tangling together into something almost unbearable. "This is exactly the kind of thing your mother warned me about," she said, her voice muffled. "Maybe she was right to be worried. Maybe this world just isn't built for someone like me." "Don't say that," Alexander said firmly, pulling her hands gently away from her face so he could look directly into her eyes. "None of this is your fault, Alina. This is the ugly side of a world I didn't choose either, not something you brought into our relationship. If anything, this proves exactly the opposite of what the article suggests. You've had nothing but genuine feelings for me since the moment we met, and someone from your past couldn't stand seeing you happy, so they tried to destroy it." Alina searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt, any suggestion that the public scrutiny had shaken his confidence in what they were building together, but found only steady determination staring back at her. "This isn't going to stop," she said quietly. "Is it? Even if we get past this particular article, there will be more scrutiny. More attempts to dig into my life, twist things, find angles that make good headlines regardless of truth." "Some of that is likely true," Alexander admitted. "Public life comes with certain unavoidable intrusions. But I promise you, Alina, I will do everything within my power to protect you from as much of it as possible. And more importantly, I need you to know that none of this changes how I feel about you. If anything, watching how you're handling this, with grace and honesty despite how unfair it is, only confirms what I already knew about the kind of person you are." Alina felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the events of the day, but grateful, deeply so, for the steady presence beside her refusing to waver despite the storm swirling around them. The situation grew more complicated the following week when Alexander's former fiancée, a woman named Victoria, whom Alina had heard mentioned only briefly during earlier conversations, resurfaced unexpectedly at a charity gala Alexander was scheduled to attend for one of his family's foundations. Alina had planned to accompany him, their first public appearance together since the tabloid article, a deliberate choice on Alexander's part to demonstrate that neither of them intended to hide from the scrutiny. Victoria approached them within the first hour of the event, elegant and composed in a way that immediately put Alina on edge, her smile carrying an edge of calculation that made the earlier tabloid article's insinuations feel suddenly, uncomfortably relevant, though aimed at the wrong woman entirely. "Alexander," Victoria said smoothly, "it's been far too long, and this must be the woman everyone's been talking about." "Victoria," Alexander said, his tone polite but noticeably cool, "this is Alina." "Alina, Victoria." "Charmed," Victoria said, though her eyes moved over Alina with the same assessing quality Alina remembered from the Duchess, though carrying none of the underlying warmth she had eventually sensed beneath Alexander's mother's initial coolness. "I read about you, of course. The whole city has, it seems. Rather unfortunate timing for such a story to break, don't you think, right when things seem to be going so well for you too?" Something in Victoria's tone made Alina's suspicion sharpen immediately. "You seem remarkably well informed about the details," she said carefully. "One hears things," Victoria said with a dismissive wave of her hand, though her smile remained fixed and unsettling. "Small world, this one. Everyone knows everyone eventually." Alexander's jaw tightened visibly. "If you'll excuse us, Victoria, we should greet our other hosts." He guided Alina away with a firm hand at her lower back, and once they were out of earshot, Alina turned to him with growing certainty. "She knows something," she said quietly. "The way she talked about the timing, about being informed. Alexander, do you think she could be involved?" "I think it's entirely possible," Alexander said grimly. "Victoria never forgave me for ending things once I learned her true motivations. If she saw an opportunity to cause trouble, to undermine whatever happiness I've found since then, I wouldn't put it past her to take it." The rest of the evening carried an undercurrent of tension that Alina couldn't fully shake, Victoria's presence looming at the edges of every conversation, her occasional pointed comments to other guests carrying implications Alina felt but couldn't quite prove. By the time they left the gala, Alina felt emotionally exhausted, the weight of navigating a world with hidden currents and calculated cruelty pressing heavily on her chest. "I need to know something," she said as they sat together in the back of Alexander's car, the city lights streaming past the windows. "If this gets worse, if the pressure keeps building, if your mother's concerns turn out to have some validity in the sense that this life is simply too complicated for someone like me to navigate, what happens to us?" Alexander turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Alina, listen to me carefully. I have spent years surrounded by people who calculate every interaction for personal advantage, who see relationships as transactions rather than genuine connections. You are the first person in longer than I can remember who has never once made me feel like a transaction. Whatever complications arise, whatever ugliness people like Victoria or tabloid journalists try to create, none of it changes the fundamental truth of what exists between us. I'm not going anywhere, and I need you to trust that, even when things feel overwhelming. Alina searched his face in the dim light of the car, finding nothing but sincerity staring back at her, and felt some of the anxious tension in her chest finally begin to ease. "I trust you," she said quietly. "I just wish this world came with fewer complications." "So do I," Alexander admitted with a tired smile. "But I'd rather face those complications with you than face an uncomplicated life without you." "That's not even a difficult choice, Alina." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the car continued through the quiet late-night streets, and for a moment, despite everything unresolved and threatening on the horizon, she allowed herself to simply exist in the comfort of his presence, trusting that whatever storms lay ahead, they would find a way through them together. But as the car pulled up outside her apartment building, Alina's phone buzzed with a new message, and glancing at the screen, she felt her stomach drop all over again. It was from an unknown number, a single line of text that made the hair on her arms stand up with sudden, sharp unease. "You should have stayed away from him. This is only the beginning." Alina stared at the message for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before turning her phone toward Alexander with trembling hands. He read it once, then again, his expression shifting from confusion to controlled fury in the span of a few seconds. "Show me the number," he said, his voice tight. Alina handed him the phone, and he studied the unfamiliar digits carefully before pulling out his own phone and typing something quickly, presumably to whoever handled matters like this on his behalf. "I'm having my security team trace this immediately," he said. "Alina, I don't want you staying alone tonight. Please come back to my apartment. At least until we understand what we're dealing with." Alina hesitated only briefly before nodding, too shaken by the message to argue about independence or propriety. They drove in tense silence to Alexander's apartment across the city, and once inside, Alina found herself pacing the length of his living room while he made a series of quiet, urgent phone calls, his voice carrying the same controlled authority she remembered from the wedding, though now edged with genuine concern rather than simple confidence. "My security team believes the message was sent using a temporary number, difficult to trace directly," he said once he finally set his phone down, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But they're confident it connects to the same source as the tabloid article. Whoever is behind this has been planning it carefully." "Owen wouldn't send something like that," Alina said slowly, trying to reconcile the image of her ex-fiancé, flawed and occasionally cruel in his own selfish way, with someone capable of sending threatening anonymous messages. "He's petty, and he was clearly angry when he showed up drunk at the wedding, but this feels different, more calculated." "Victoria has resources Owen doesn't," Alexander said grimly, "and motive stretching back years, not months. I think we need to consider the possibility that they're working together, whether directly or simply exploiting each other's grievances toward the same end." The theory settled uncomfortably in Alina's mind over the following days, though proving it seemed nearly impossible given the careful anonymity surrounding both the tabloid article and the threatening message. Alexander's security team continued investigating quietly, while Alina tried to maintain some semblance of normal routine, though the anxiety of the unknown threat colored every moment, every unfamiliar face on the street suddenly feeling like a potential source of danger. The situation escalated further 4 days later when Alina arrived at her office to find a small package waiting at her desk, no return address, simply her name printed neatly on the label. Her coworkers assumed it was a personal delivery and thought nothing of it, but Alina's hands trembled as she carefully opened the box, finding inside a single photograph of herself, clearly taken without her knowledge outside her own apartment building just the previous morning, along with a note written in the same anonymous, threatening tone as the earlier text message. Enjoy your new life while it lasts. Some people don't belong where they've forced their way in. Alina called Alexander immediately, her voice shaking as she described the package, and within the hour he had arrived at her office personally, along with 2 members of his security team who carefully collected the package for evidence while speaking quietly with the building's security about reviewing camera footage. "This has gone far enough," Alexander said, his jaw set with barely contained anger as they sat together in his car afterward. "I've engaged a private investigator, someone experienced in exactly this kind of situation. We're going to find whoever is responsible, and I promise you, Alina, they will face consequences." "I'm scared," Alina admitted quietly, the admission costing her something, the fear she had been trying to suppress finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "Whoever this is, they know where I live. They're watching me, Alexander. That's not something I can simply brush aside." "I know," he said, reaching for her hand, "which is why I'd like you to consider staying with me, at least temporarily, until we resolve this. My apartment has proper security cameras, a doorman who knows exactly who should and shouldn't be granted access. I would feel considerably better knowing you're safe." Alina considered his offer, torn between the instinct toward independence that had carried her through the difficult months after her breakup with Owen, and the very real fear now settling into her chest at the thought of returning to her own apartment alone. Ultimately, practicality won out over pride, and she agreed to stay with Alexander while the investigation continued. The following week passed in an uneasy blur, Alina working from Alexander's apartment when possible, accompanied by security whenever she needed to leave for meetings or errands, the constant vigilance exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Alexander remained a steady, reassuring presence throughout, though she could see the toll the situation was taking on him as well, the tension visible in the set of his shoulders, the way he checked his phone constantly for updates from the investigation. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, nearly 2 weeks after the threatening message first arrived, when Alexander's private investigator uncovered a pattern of financial transactions linking Owen directly to a payment from a tabloid publication, the timing matching precisely with the article's publication date. Further investigation revealed phone records showing repeated contact between Owen and Victoria in the weeks leading up to both the article and the threatening messages, confirming Alexander's earlier suspicion that the two had been working together, bound by shared resentment toward the happiness Alina and Alexander had built. "We have enough evidence to pursue legal action against both of them," Alexander told Alina as they sat together reviewing the investigator's final report, spread across the coffee table in his living room. "Harassment, invasion of privacy, potentially stalking charges given the photograph and threatening messages. My lawyers believe we have a strong case." Alina felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease as she processed the information, grateful finally to understand the source of the threat, but disturbed by the depth of calculation and cruelty involved. "I still don't fully understand why," she said quietly. "Owen ended things with me. He's the one who walked away. Why would he go to such lengths to hurt me now, months later, simply because I found happiness with someone else? Some people can't stand seeing someone move on successfully after they've caused pain," Alexander said gently. "It challenges the narrative they've built for themselves, the idea that leaving was somehow justified or inconsequential. Your happiness, ironically, probably felt like an accusation to him, evidence that he made a mistake he can't take back." "And Victoria?" "Similar in some ways," Alexander said, "though her motivations run deeper, connected to years of feeling entitled to a life she lost through her own choices. She valued the title over me, and now watching someone else potentially claim both the title and genuine affection I never offered her, that's likely unbearable for someone as calculating as she's always been." Alina absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the depth of resentment required to orchestrate such an elaborate campaign of harassment with the relatively brief, uncomplicated happiness she had found since the wedding. It seemed almost absurd, the idea that her simple joy could inspire such calculated cruelty from people who should have had no claim on her life anymore. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed, Alexander's resources and connections ensuring the case received serious attention rather than languishing in bureaucratic delay. Owen, faced with clear financial evidence and the threat of significant legal consequences, ultimately admitted to selling information to the tabloid, though he denied any involvement in the threatening messages or the photograph, a denial that Alina found difficult to fully believe given his history of impulsive, vindictive behavior. Victoria proved more difficult to pin down definitively, her family's own resources and legal team working diligently to insulate her from direct consequences, though the investigation's findings were damaging enough to her social standing that she quietly withdrew from the social circles she had once dominated, her reputation among their shared acquaintances irrevocably tarnished by the revelations. The threatening messages stopped abruptly once legal action began, whether from genuine fear of consequences or simply the satisfaction of having caused sufficient disruption. Alina couldn't be certain. But the silence brought its own kind of relief, the constant vigilance she had maintained for weeks gradually easing as days passed without further incident. "I keep thinking about how close this came to destroying everything," Alina admitted one evening, several weeks after the legal proceedings had concluded, as she and Alexander sat together on his balcony, overlooking the city lights spread out below them. "If I had let the fear win, if I had decided this world was simply too dangerous, too complicated for someone like me to navigate." "But you didn't," Alexander said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her closer against the cool evening air. "You faced it head on, with more courage than I've seen from people who have spent their entire lives navigating situations like this." "I had help," Alina said, leaning into him gratefully. "I couldn't have gotten through any of this without you standing beside me the entire way." "That's rather the point of standing beside someone," Alexander said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Through the good and the difficult equally." Alina tilted her face up to look at him, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes, and felt something settle deeply and permanently into place within her chest, a certainty that had been building steadily since that first dance at her sister's wedding, now fully crystallized after weathering genuine adversity together rather than simply the easy comfort of early romance. "I love you," she said quietly, the words emerging with more confidence than she expected, though her heart still pounded with the vulnerability of the admission. "I don't think I've said that yet, not out loud, but I need you to know it's true." Alexander's expression softened into something Alina hadn't seen from him before, raw and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. You walked into my life at a wedding I almost didn't attend, and somehow, in the span of a few months, you've become the person I can't imagine my future without." Alina felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, happy ones this time, entirely different from the fear and exhaustion that had colored so many recent weeks. She leaned up to kiss him, slow and certain, the city lights twinkling around them like something out of a story she never imagined she would find herself living. And for the first time since this entire journey began, she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that whatever came next, they would face it together. Winter settled over the city gradually, the trees along Alina Street shedding their last golden leaves, the air carrying a crisp bite that sent people hurrying between warm doorways. Nearly 4 months had passed since the wedding, and Alina found herself, on a quiet December afternoon, sitting across from the Dowager Duchess in the same drawing room at Camden Hall, where their first tense conversation had taken place, though the atmosphere now felt entirely different. "I owe you an apology," the Duchess said, setting down her teacup with careful precision. "For my behavior during your first visit here. I've had time to reflect, particularly given everything that occurred with that dreadful tabloid business, and I realize now that my initial caution, while perhaps understandable, was unfair to you specifically." Elinor set down her own cup, surprised by the directness of the admission. "You were trying to protect your son," she said gently. "I understood that, even if it was uncomfortable at the time." "Perhaps," the Duchess allowed, "but I judged you based on my previous experience with Victoria, rather than taking the time to properly know you as your own person. When those horrible articles started circulating, when someone tried to destroy what you and Alexander had built, I watched how you handled it. With honesty, with courage, refusing to hide or crumble despite how frightening the entire situation must have been." She paused, something softening in her expression. "That is not the behavior of someone motivated by calculation, Miss Hart. I recognize that now." "Thank you," Elinor said sincerely, feeling something warm settle in her chest at the acknowledgement. "That means more to me than you probably realize." "I imagine it does," the Duchess said with the faintest hint of a smile, the first genuine warmth Elinor had seen from her since they met. "Alexander has been different since he met you. Lighter, somehow, despite everything that's happened. I haven't seen him this way since before his father passed, if I'm entirely honest. That alone tells me something important about the influence you've had on his life." Their conversation continued for another hour, gradually shifting from careful formality into something approaching genuine warmth, the Duchess asking about Elinor's family, her work, her childhood, with what appeared to be authentic curiosity rather than the calculated assessment Elinor remembered from their first meeting. By the time Alexander returned from a meeting with the estate's tenant committee, finding the two women deep in easy conversation, laughing together over some shared observation about Alexander's stubbornness as a child, he paused in the doorway with visible surprise. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, glancing between his mother and Elinor with obvious curiosity. "Not at all," the Duchess said, rising gracefully from her seat. "Elinor and I were simply getting properly acquainted, something we should have done months ago." She turned to Elinor with a warm smile. "You must come again soon, my dear. Perhaps for Christmas if you're free." "I would love that," Elinor said sincerely, watching as the Duchess excused herself to attend to other matters, leaving Elinor and Alexander alone in the drawing room. "What happened?" Alexander asked once his mother had gone, settling onto the sofa beside Elinor with obvious astonishment still coloring his expression. "I've never seen her warm to anyone that quickly." "I think she just needed time," Elinor said. "Time to see that I wasn't going anywhere, that I meant what I said about caring for you rather than your title." "She invited you for Christmas," Alexander said, something like wonder in his voice. "Elinor, that's not a small gesture. My mother doesn't extend invitations like that lightly." "I noticed," Elinor said with a smile, leaning into him as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The following weeks brought a comfortable rhythm to their relationship, the earlier chaos of the tabloid scandal and threatening messages fading gradually into memory as normal life reasserted itself. Elinor introduced Alexander properly to her own family during a quiet dinner at her parents' house, watching with quiet delight as her father, initially somewhat intimidated by the prospect of hosting a duke at his modest dining table, gradually relaxed into easy conversation, once Alexander proved genuinely interested in hearing about her father's decades-long career as a civil engineer, asking thoughtful questions rather than simply performing polite interest. Grace and her husband joined them as well, and the evening stretched late into the night, filled with laughter and easy conversation that left Elinor feeling more content than she had in longer than she could remember. Watching Alexander interact naturally with her family, without any hint of condescension or discomfort despite the obvious differences in their circumstances, only deepened her certainty about the life she wanted to build alongside him. "Your family is wonderful," Alexander told her later that night as they drove back toward the city, the darkness outside broken only by occasional streetlights. I can see exactly where you learned your particular blend of warmth and stubbornness. Careful, Elinor said with a laugh. That almost sounded like an insult buried in a compliment. Never, Alexander said, glancing at her with obvious affection. I meant every word as praise, I promise you. As Christmas approached, Elinor found herself once again making the familiar drive toward Camden Hall, though this time without the nervous anxiety that had accompanied her first visit months earlier. The estate had transformed for the holiday season, evergreen garlands draped along the staircases, a massive tree standing in the great hall, its branches heavy with ornaments that Alexander explained had been passed down through generations of his family. The Christmas gathering proved considerably warmer than Elinor's first visit, the Duchess greeting her with a genuine embrace rather than the cool, assessing handshake from months earlier, introducing her to extended family members with obvious pride rather than the careful reserve Elinor remembered from their initial meeting. It was on Christmas Eve, following a formal dinner filled with laughter and warmth that Elinor could hardly have imagined possible during that first tense visit, that Alexander suggested a walk through the gardens despite the cold, insisting he wanted to show her something before the night ended. The gardens looked entirely different in winter than they had during her first visit, frost coating the bare rose bushes, the reflecting pool frozen at its edges, moonlight casting everything in silver and shadow. Alexander led her toward the small Greek folly at the far end of the garden, where he had arranged for a small brazier to be lit, warm firelight flickering against the cold night air. "This is beautiful," Elinor said, wrapping her coat more tightly around herself as they approached the warm glow of the fire. "Though I confess, I'm slightly confused about why we needed to brave the cold for it." Alexander turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made Elinor's breath catch, a nervousness she hadn't seen from him since perhaps their very first conversation at the wedding, months ago now, though it felt simultaneously like a lifetime and merely yesterday. "I brought you here because this was the first place I truly opened up to you," he said quietly. "That afternoon in the gardens, months ago, when I told you I had faith we would find our way through whatever challenges arose. I believed that then, but I don't think I fully understood how deeply I would come to feel it." Elinor felt her heart begin to race, some instinct already anticipating what was coming even as her rational mind cautioned against getting ahead of herself. "Alexander," she said softly. "Let me finish," he said, his voice carrying the same steady certainty she remembered from that first dance, though now edged with genuine vulnerability. "Elinor Hart, from the moment I saw you sitting alone at your sister's wedding, refusing to perform happiness you didn't feel simply for the sake of appearances, I knew there was something different about you. Something honest and genuine, and entirely unlike anything I had encountered in years surrounded by people calculating every interaction for personal advantage." He reached into his coat pocket, and Elinor's breath caught fully as he withdrew a small velvet box, sinking gracefully to one knee on the frost-covered ground before her. "We've weathered scandal and threats and my mother's initial coldness together," Alexander continued, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind it. "You never once wavered, never once suggested this world was too complicated to navigate, even when every reasonable instinct might have told you to walk away. I love you more than I ever imagined possible, and I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would agree to spend the rest of your life beside me. Elinor, will you marry me?" Elinor stared down at him, tears already streaming freely down her cheeks despite the cold, her heart so full she could barely form words for a long moment. "Yes," she finally managed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, of course, yes." Alexander rose swiftly, slipping the ring onto her trembling finger before pulling her into a tight embrace, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously as the warm firelight flickered around them, and the cold winter stars shone brilliantly overhead. When they finally kissed, Alina felt every ounce of doubt and fear from the past months dissolve entirely, replaced by a certainty so complete it felt like coming home to something she hadn't fully known she was searching for. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life proving that this was never about anything except finding you." "You already have," Alexander said softly, resting his forehead against hers, the warm glow of the brazier casting golden light across both their faces. "Every single day since that wedding, you've proven it, over and over in ways both large and small." They stood together in the frost-covered garden for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, the distant sounds of the Christmas celebration continuing inside the great house, entirely unaware of the moment unfolding quietly beneath the winter stars. Alina glanced down at the ring on her finger, an elegant antique setting that Alexander later explained had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had, in their own ways, navigated the same complicated blend of duty and love that came with joining this particular family. "Your mother," Alina said suddenly, a flush of nervous excitement crossing her face. "Does she know about tonight?" Alexander smiled warmly. "She helped me choose the ring, actually. She's been waiting all evening, probably watching from the drawing room window this very moment, wondering what's taking us so long." Alina laughed, genuine and unrestrained, the sound carrying clearly through the quiet winter air. "Then perhaps we shouldn't keep her waiting any longer." They walked back toward the great house hand in hand, the warm glow of countless windows welcoming them home. And as they stepped through the heavy front doors, the Duchess appeared immediately in the entrance hall, her expression already knowing, already delighted, opening her arms to embrace Alina with genuine warmth the moment she spotted the ring glittering on her hand. "Welcome to the family, my dear," the Duchess said, her voice thick with emotion. "Properly this time." Alina returned the embrace fully, feeling, for the first time since this entire extraordinary journey began at her sister's wedding months earlier, that she had finally found not just love, but genuine belonging, in a world she never imagined would become her own. The months following the engagement passed in a whirlwind of planning that Alina could scarcely have imagined during the quiet, uncertain days after her breakup with Owen. Where her sister's wedding had felt like a distant, almost painful reminder of everything she thought she might never have, her own wedding planning became instead a joyful collaboration between two families who had, against considerable odds, grown to genuinely care for each other. The Duchess proved an unexpectedly enthusiastic partner in the planning process, her decades of experience organizing events at Camden Hall translating into practical wisdom that Alina found herself grateful for rather than overwhelmed by. Together, they walked the estate's gardens discussing where the ceremony might take place, debated flower arrangements over afternoon tea, and gradually built something Alina recognized as genuine friendship, rather than the cautious tolerance she had feared might be the best she could hope for. Alina's own mother, initially somewhat starstruck by the prospect of her daughter marrying into such an established family, gradually settled into her own comfortable role, insisting on contributing certain traditions from their own family history. Small touches that reminded Alina this celebration belonged as much to her ordinary upbringing as it did to Alexander's centuries-old lineage. Grace, unsurprisingly, appointed herself matron of honor with characteristic enthusiasm, flying out for dress fittings and planning sessions whenever her own schedule allowed, teasing Alina mercilessly about the poetic justice of her once overlooked older sister, now planning a wedding considerably grander than her own had been. "Do you remember Table 11?" Grace asked one afternoon, as the two sisters sat together reviewing seating charts for the upcoming ceremony, an activity that carried obvious echoes of the very evening that had started this entire journey. "How could I forget?" Alina said with a laugh, glancing up from the elaborate chart spread across the table between them. "I was so certain that night was going to be one of the loneliest of my entire life. And instead, Grace said, reaching over to squeeze her sister's hand. "It became the beginning of everything good that's happened to you since." Alina considered her sister's words, tracing back through the months since that fateful evening, the terror of the tabloid scandal and threatening messages, the slow warming of a mother who had initially seen her as a threat rather than a genuine partner for her son, the deepening of a connection that had started with a simple, unexpected dance and grown into something Alina now couldn't imagine her life without. "I almost didn't go that night," Alina admitted quietly. "After everything with Owen, part of me wanted to make an excuse, stay home, avoid watching you have everything I thought I'd never have myself." "I'm so glad you didn't," Grace said sincerely. "Though I still feel terrible about that seating arrangement. I promise you that was entirely the wedding planner's doing, not mine." "I know," Alina said with a laugh, "though in hindsight I suppose I should probably thank her. If I'd been seated at the family table that night, front and center with everyone watching, Alexander might never have noticed me at all." The weeks leading up to the wedding brought their own share of chaos, dress fittings that required careful coordination between Alina's schedule and the renowned designer. Alexander's mother had insisted on commissioning, endless discussions about guest lists that inevitably grew larger as distant relatives and family friends learned of the upcoming celebration, and the particular stress of coordinating security given Alexander's public profile. A necessity Alina had grown to accept as simply part of the life she was choosing to build alongside him. Owen's legal troubles had concluded months earlier, a settlement reached that included a formal apology and financial compensation that Alina had ultimately decided to donate to a charity supporting victims of harassment, unwilling to let money tainted by such cruelty simply enrich her own life. Victoria, for her part, had largely disappeared from the social circles she once dominated, occasional mentions of her reaching Alina secondhand through mutual acquaintances, though she made no further attempts at contact or interference as the wedding approached. Spring arrived at Camden Hall in full, glorious bloom, the same gardens where Alexander had first opened up about his own broken engagement, now transformed into a riot of color, roses climbing along ancient stone walls, the reflecting pool reflecting a sky so blue it seemed almost unreal against the backdrop of centuries-old architecture. The morning of the wedding, Alina stood in the same drawing room where she had first nervously met the Duchess, now transformed into a bridal preparation space filled with laughter and gentle chaos, her mother and Grace fussing over the final details of her dress, while the Duchess herself supervised with the practiced efficiency of someone who had organized countless significant events across this very house. "You look radiant," her mother said, tears already forming in her eyes as she helped adjust the delicate veil cascading down Alina's back. "I still can't quite believe this is happening. My daughter marrying at Camden Hall." "Neither can I, if I'm honest," Alina admitted, studying her reflection in the tall mirror positioned near the window, sunlight streaming in to illuminate the elegant lines of the dress she had chosen months earlier, simple and timeless rather than ostentatious, a reflection of who she genuinely was rather than an attempt to fit some expected mold of nobility. The Duchess approached quietly, waiting until Alina's mother had stepped away momentarily to attend to some final detail before speaking. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth Alina had come to treasure over the months of their growing friendship. "When Alexander first told me about you, I feared history repeating itself, another woman drawn to what my son could offer rather than who he genuinely is. I have never been so grateful to be wrong about anything in my entire life." Alina felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes, careful not to disturb the makeup that had taken considerable time to perfect that morning. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me the chance to prove that, even when it would have been easier for you to simply remain guarded." "You made it easy in the end," the Duchess said, pressing a gentle kiss to Alina's cheek. "Now, let's not keep my son waiting any longer than absolutely necessary. I believe he's been pacing the length of the east wing for the better part of an hour already." Laughter rippled through the room at this observation, and soon Alina found herself standing at the top of the grand staircase, her father waiting beside her with obvious pride and emotion. The sound of a string quartet drifting up from the gardens below where the ceremony would take place beneath the same ancient oak trees that had first greeted her the day of that nervous initial visit to Camden Hall. "Ready?" her father asked, offering his arm. "I think I've been ready for months," Alina said with a smile, though her heart still pounded with the particular nervousness that accompanied significant, life-altering moments. They descended the staircase together and made their way through the house toward the garden entrance, where Alina could see, through the tall windows, rows of white chairs arranged beneath the oak canopy, filled with faces both familiar and new, family and friends from both sides of a divide that had once seemed impossibly wide but now felt, standing here on the morning of her wedding, entirely natural and complete. As the doors opened and the music shifted into the familiar processional melody, Alina caught her first glimpse of Alexander waiting at the far end of the garden aisle, standing beneath an arch woven with white roses and greenery, his expression already emotional despite his obvious attempts at composure, watching her approach with the same steady, unwavering attention she remembered from their very first dance, months ago now. Though it felt as though an entire lifetime had unfolded between that moment and this one. She walked slowly down the aisle on her father's arm, past faces she recognized from that very first wedding where this entire journey began, past Grace standing as matron of honor with tears streaming freely down her face, past the Duchess seated in the front row, her expression radiating a warmth that would have seemed impossible during their first tense meeting months earlier. When she finally reached Alexander, her father placed her hand gently in his before stepping back to take his seat, and Alina found herself gazing up into the eyes of the man who had crossed a crowded wedding hall to ask an overlooked, heartbroken woman to dance, never imagining that single act of kindness would grow into the foundation of an entire shared life. "You look extraordinary," Alexander murmured, his voice thick with emotion as the officiant began the ceremony. "So do you," Alina whispered back, unable to fully suppress her smile despite the formal solemnity of the moment. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and quiet emotion, both of them speaking words they had written themselves rather than relying on traditional formulas, references to that first dance, to the courage it had taken to trust each other despite the complications their different worlds had brought, to the family and friends who had ultimately united around their shared happiness, rather than allowing scandal or fear to tear it apart. When Alexander finally kissed her as husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted into applause and cheering, the sound carrying across the garden and echoing off the ancient stone walls of Camden Hall, a celebration that felt entirely different from the quiet, private ache Alina had carried into her sister's wedding all those months earlier, sitting alone at table 11, uncertain whether she would ever find happiness of her own. The reception that followed unfolded in the same great hall where Christmas garlands had once decorated the staircases, now transformed instead with spring flowers and soft candlelight, hundreds of guests celebrating late into the evening. The same band Alexander had originally hired for smaller family gatherings, now playing for the largest celebration Camden Hall had witnessed in decades. As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, Alexander led Alina toward the center of the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife, the assembled guests forming a circle around them, phones raised to capture the moment, though Alina found herself entirely oblivious to anything beyond the man now holding her close, the same steady warmth in his eyes that had first captivated her across a crowded hall months earlier. "Do you remember what you asked me during our very first dance?" Alina asked softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they swayed together to the gentle music. "I asked why you looked like you needed rescuing," Alexander said, a smile evident in his voice. "And do you remember what I asked you?" "You asked why I chose you," he said. "Out of everyone in that room." "And what would you say now?" Alina asked, pulling back slightly to look up into his eyes. "If I asked you that same question again tonight?" Alexander considered the question with the same thoughtful seriousness she remembered from that very first conversation, before answering with quiet certainty. "I would say I chose you because you were the only honest thing in an entire room full of performance," he said. "I would say that every single day since then, you've continued proving that same honesty, through scandal and fear, and every complication this strange life of mine could throw at us. And I would say that I would choose you again, without hesitation, in every single lifetime imaginable, given the chance." Alina felt tears gather in her eyes, happy ones, overwhelming in their intensity, and leaned up to kiss him gently as the music continued, and their guests applauded around them, the golden light of countless candles casting everything in a warm, timeless glow. Later that night, as the celebration finally began winding down, and guests started their gradual departures, Alina found a quiet moment to slip away toward the same garden folly where Alexander had proposed months earlier, now decorated with soft fairy lights strung between the columns, the reflecting pool nearby catching fragments of moonlight across its still surface. Alexander found her there a short while later, having noticed her absence from the celebration, and joined her quietly at the edge of the pool, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they both looked out over the peaceful grounds of the estate that had, over the past year, become as much her home as it had always been his. "I keep thinking about that first night," Alina said softly. "How certain I was that I would spend the entire wedding feeling invisible, overlooked, forgotten, and instead it became the night everything changed." "Life has a way of surprising us," Alexander said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Sometimes the loneliest moments turn out to be exactly where the best parts of our story are waiting to begin." Alina smiled, leaning into him fully, feeling the weight of an entire year's journey settling into something like peaceful contentment, the fear and uncertainty and scandal of the past months finally giving way to the simple, profound happiness of standing here, on her wedding night, beside the man who had once crossed an entire crowded hall simply to ask an overlooked woman to dance. "I love you," she said quietly, the words carrying all the weight and certainty of everything they had built together since that first unexpected evening. "I love you too," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever imagined possible, and more with each passing day." They stood together beneath the moonlit sky, the sounds of the wedding celebration drifting faintly from the great house behind them, and Alina found herself thinking, not for the first time, about the strange and beautiful unpredictability of life, about how a single dance, offered by a stranger at her sister's wedding, had somehow become the foundation for everything good that had followed. Table 11, she realized with quiet gratitude, had never really been about being overlooked at all. It had simply been the place where her real story was waiting patiently to begin.